lovely introduction, Rob. I do not have no idea whether I will manage to live up to it or not. I will do my best. Let's balance this thing up. I'm doing this because, among other things, my publisher says that paperback copies are out of stock. So I have to, since I don't know whether we have a book table or not, but at least this way the image will remain with you if we're lucky. Can you hear? Okay, good. I'm going to start by reading you a little of my novel. Around 1984, I began to drift away from writing science fiction, which is what I had written for the first, 30 years of my career. And since 1984, I have not written I've not written any science fiction, with the exception of this thing. As I said, it is a science fiction novel. About 6 years ago, a study was done in England. And what they did is they talked to all sorts of people and went around interviewing people and tabulating the results. And what they found was that gay, straight, male, female, black, white, and Asian, those people who had more sex were happier than those who did not. So that's the science in my novel. Eric Jeffers has come to a small town on the coast of Georgia called Diamond Harbor, a foundering tourist town which has seen much, much better days. His mother is now working there as a waitress in a local diner. Eric's stepfather, who was indeed married to his mother, and he's been living with in Atlanta, a black welder named Mike. Getting into Diamond Harbor, he very quickly, at a truck stop restroom, meets up with a young man a couple of years older than he is, who goes by the somewhat egregious nickname of Shit, which he has been called since he was about 10 years old. And he, sort of in the manner of rebellious 12-year-olds, he decided, well, if they're going to call me shit, I'm going to relish it. Everybody's got to call me that. And so people have indeed been calling them. And then, as such things do, what starts off as a scandal pretty soon becomes a general local banality. Eric and Shit end up living together. The name of the neighborhood that Rob was talking about is a sort of precursor to that is a neighborhood called the Dump, which is a largely gay male homosexual enclave that is supported by the work of a black queer multi-millionaire who has decided to establish a foundation for the betterment of the lives of black gay men. So Shit and his father Dynamite are the two local garbage men, and Eric becomes their helper, and the three of them are working together. As things go along, basically what happens at one point after they have been together for about 3 years and are now living together in the Dump and going to work every day, their boss is another gay man named Randall, who has gotten involved with a local itinerant Hispanic fellow named Ace. And Eric, remembering how it took him quite a while to get accustomed to the neighborhood and what have you, has invited Randall and Ace over to their house on a Sunday afternoon for some barbecued spare ribs and boiled corn and coleslaw. And so the Sunday for the big event arrives. On Sunday morning, just after 12:30, Eric finished grating the carrots into the stainless steel bowl he held slanted on a folded towel on the kitchen table, between the toolbox and a pile of old magazines. Beside it, on the place he'd wiped pretty clean, a cabbage sat in two halves. Eric picked up one and began to draw it back and forth over the wire half of the vegetable grater, which snowed white cabbage over the orange pile. Shit, you want to get the mayonnaise out the icebox? That little bowl with the aluminum foil over it is some grated onions. You want to bring that over here too with it? Sure, Shit said. And you want that celery salt too, don't you? That's right. Dynamite stepped into the side door and said, "Hey, I just slopped some of your vinegar and hot pepper sauce over them ribs outside on the grill. They're smelling real good." "Thanks," Eric said. "I'll leave turning them to you, though," Dynamite said. "Next time I touch them," Eric said, "they're coming off. They're pretty much done." Outside, a car grunted and growled, nearing. Shit said, "I think our company's here." "Then let's go say hello." Eric pulled off the tin foil and felt his eyes begin to water, dumped in the onions and ran the wooden spoon back and forth over the bowl's bottom, then through the slaw. Tapping it on the edge, he turned to follow Shit and Dynamite out onto the deck to stand beside the grill. Near them, against the wall, stood a bag of charcoal. On the table next to it stood a coffee can of barbecue sauce, in which leaned the handle of a brush. Over the table's boards, irregular splotches of sauce made a trail from the can toward the grill. The car door of the dirty yellow Dodge opened, and Randall slid out. He had on a new plaid shirt, which made Eric aware that Dynamite was wearing a pretty spotty t-shirt under his bibs, though it had come out of the dryer yesterday evening. "Hey there, Randall," Dynamite said. "Good to see you, boss." "Hey, guys, I know I'm a few minutes early, but I was sitting around by myself feeling antsy till finally I decided, hell, I'd just come on over. If I'm in the way, tell me, and I'll drive around and come back. Maybe I can run over and pick up something for you if you need it." No, Eric said. "That's fine. The ribs are done. You've about got it timed. You couldn't have timed it better." "You're always welcome, boss man," Dynamite said. "You want a beer? You boys go in there and bring some out. I know that you ain't having none. They got lemonade for them. Shit made it up this morning fresh. You can have some of that if you want." "Maybe later," Randall said. "No, I'll take that beer." Shit asked, "Where's Ace? He want one too?" "No." Randall pulled in a big, loud breath. "It's just gonna be me today." "Oh," Dynamite said. "I was looking forward to seeing him." Eric took a step back toward the kitchen, but because Shit did not, he hesitated. Dynamite said, "He coming later?" Sit down, boss man, right here." Dynamite dropped his hand on the back of the bench. "No," Randall said. "He's gone. Ace left yesterday. I asked him if he didn't want to stay another few days, just to come on by and try out your ribs, but he said no, he wanted to get on. So I run him down to Turpin's, and I'm damned if he didn't pick up a ride in 10 minutes, just walking around the back lot and asking the Sunday rig guys if any of them would take him. I was going to call you and tell you not to fix for him, but it was funny. Once I got back home, I kept on thinking maybe he'd change his mind and come on back. It was like I was expecting him to walk through the front door saying he'd changed his mind. Randall shrugged, but he didn't. Oh, Dynamite repeated, taking longer to say it. Well, I guess that just means there's more for us. Eric said, I'm going in and get you that beer. He turned and walked over the deck. Come on up and have a seat. Them ribs do smell good, Randall said and started up the steps. You do 'em with that vinegar sauce? That's the kind I really like. It's what I grew up on. The rest is all ketchup and sugar. I guess they're okay, but to me that ain't barbecue. Eric stepped into the kitchen. Out on the porch, Randall was saying, So you guys have been together 3 years, huh? That's something. Ace said since the solar panels were all up, he was going to take off, get a ride to Florida, and spend the rest of the winter down there. Ace has been working with Randall with a group that's been going around installing solar panels up and down the highway. And spend the rest of the winter down there. I guess 3 months was all he could stand on my black ass. But I tell you, I'm going to miss his little warm butt up against my belly every night. Eric went to the refrigerator, vaguely aware that shit had stepped into the kitchen behind him. Eric felt a little odd that the guest of honor had not come, but since Randall was there, it probably would be okay. Eric opened the refrigerator door and stood looking into the crowded shelves. Something grappled him from behind and whispered against his ear, Jesus. A cage of bone constricted around him. That's what it felt like. Eric reached up and grasped Shit's forearm, locked high across his chest. Shit whispered, Please, 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 nigga, don't go. Don't decide you want to go to Florida or Atlanta or any place like that. Eric tried to keep his balance because Shit had raised one leg and wrapped it all around in front of him. Hey, don't worry, I ain't. You sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Really? Yes, I am really, really sure. Would you get the plates and take them out there with the beer and give me 5 minutes to finish up my damn coleslaw, please? Sure. You know, I'll do anything you want, anything you ever ask me. Well, take the beer to Dynamite and Randall, and lemonade for me and you. Shit's grip loosened. Yeah, take the glasses outside, and I'll be out with y'all in 5 minutes. Hey, I wouldn't even know what to do if you left. Shit drew in a breath like Randall's when he'd stepped from the Dodge. I mean, what would happen? Well, for one thing, he wouldn't get no ribs. Come on now. Go outside and take the plates and the beer and the lemonade. I'm going to have to come back for that. Then get going. Eric turned to be surprised by Shit's wide green eyes blinking rapidly, brightly. So Eric hugged him and was again surprised by the strength of the hug Shit returned. I'm going to go on and read you something, if I have it, that is nonfiction. It's part of it's a talk, and I've tried to condense it so that it will fill up the rest of our half hour here. As I said, the general title of it is A View from the Valley's Edge, which of course is a reference to the title of the novel. Basically, the way this talk was put together is I got together a whole bunch of questions that various interviewers had asked me over the last 6 years, and the most repeated questions I decided to come up with to try and come up with answers that were fairly coherent instead of the usual mumbling and spluttering that I do when asked the same question 25 times. So here we go. A drizzly September night in Philadelphia, and I have woken up at 3. No classes tomorrow. Dennis is up in New York. Out the second floor living room window, the leaves under the street light glisten and drip. I wander from kitchen to bathroom to bedroom, back to the living room, sit down at the work table and wonder what I am going to speak about in March. One idea is to start with a list of questions various interviews have asked me over the years. To begin, I am an artist, a fiction writer, not a scientist, not a scholar. This means I have reflected a few elements from my life, reflections always incomplete, always distorted, as well as a few facets also distorted and incomplete from the world and lives around me, from which I have tried to construct one intriguing pattern or another. A question such as one that an interviewer asked me, "What do you want your legacy to be?" asked me to tell you what I have given you, and the fact is I have no way of knowing. Only someone else can answer that. Only someone else should answer it. If someone finds a pattern that has something to do at whatever level of suggestion or of correspondence with the true and the functional, only that person can say, not me. I can hope that the patterns are useful, as I can hope that they are beautiful, but any pronouncement I make about their value is simply arrogant wish fulfillment, a distortion, and a waste of time. I can't answer it, nor would I feel comfortable trying to, so that's not the kind of question I'm going to take up here. I am not a sex educator. I am not a scientist. Various sundry people assume that I am. I am only provisionally an academic. To repeat, I think of myself as a writer, specifically a fiction writer. I could not begin to claim to educate anyone about anything having to do with sex, gay, or straight. Quite secondarily, I'm an English teacher. All I can do is describe some of the things I have seen occur in the world around me and talk about some of the things I have done and some of the thoughts that I have had about them. For me, the notion of the sort of legacy that particular interviewer was describing, if I may be blunt, is absurd. I have seen enough things change already in 70 years to know that. Above and beyond phatic civility, I must live my life according to Thomas Mann's insight. About the worth of my own work, I cannot know, and you cannot tell me. That means also, I cannot tell you. A few abstract notions, such as more sophisticated ideas of discourse in general, readings, reactions, understanding, response, I might, if we are lucky, make it easier to negotiate the possibilities and contradictions inherent among the rhizomatic roller coaster tracks of change. And that, yes, has been the philosophical underpinning of my project for 40 years. Clearly, began the imaginary interviewer, there's a link between your award-winning short story, I and Gomorrah, and some of the memoir writing you've done about that period of your life in the early 60s when you were touring Greece and Turkey. Can you talk about some of the work you've done? Not just because of the locations, but because of the free-flowing sexuality of the time and some of the experiences you had. Your story, Citra et Trans, is another good example. Well, to reiterate, I'm an artist, not a scientist. That is to say, I deal in suggestions, generalizations about facts, but suggestions are very important if we are to go on to establish facts in the world, though it is equally important not to confuse one for the other, suggestion for proof. On October 18th, 1965, with a straight friend of mine, Ron Hellstrom, whom I ran into the previous spring when we were working on shrimp boats out of Aransas Pass, Texas, down near Corpus Christi and Brownsville, I took off from New York City in an Icelandic Airlines prop jet to Luxembourg for a 6-month stay in Europe that lasted till mid-April of '66. Ron and I were simply friends, although many gay men that I've met on the trip in Paris, in Venice, and in Athens, and with whom I did have sexual relations, were very generous to us. Ron and Bill Belusiak, another straight young man who joined up with us on the plane over and traveled with us for a few months, had a much better time than they would have had the third member of their traveling trio been straight. On the second day of our 2-day-week stay in Paris, when the three of us were living in the small hotel Saint-Louis on the Ile Saint-Louis, next to the Hotel Olinda, at the time its reputation was that of the cheapest hotel in Paris, and the next cheapest was right next door, I went out cruising that evening, leaving my 2 straight friends back at the hotel. A little after midnight, in the Tuileries Gardens, the park grounds just in front of the Louvre, I ran into a very tall, very black, very handsome and full-featured African in a dark blue suit, white shirt, and tie. In the shadows, he was sitting on one of the side benches, one leg crossed over the other, masturbating. I sat down with him as if I had met him on Central Park West in the same way, where I had been a few nights before, and in the same way with the same intent. We fooled around with each other. With my very poor French, I discovered he was a medical student from Senegal, studying in Paris, and whose mother was a tribal queen. His name was Bernard Lasuna, about 27 years old, that is to say 4 years older than I was. Yes, Bernard was an African prince. At his suggestion, we walked back to his small ground floor Latin Quarter room, where, in other apartments in his building, various other of his gay African friends also lived. Prince or no, Bernard's room was about 8 feet by 8, with a table on one wall and a double-deckered bunk bed against another. Bernard slept on the lower level of the bunk and used the upper for storage. In her tribal regalia, a photograph of his impressive mother, the Queen, hung on the wall, as well as others of his family, his father and uncles, and multiple mothers and aunts, and many half-brothers and sisters. Bernard and I slept a pleasant night together. The next morning, one of his friends in the building, a shy, stocky little fellow with bushy, slightly brownish hair, also from Senegal, came by, and we all had coffee and pastry at Bernard's. I explained that I was traveling with 2 other North Americans and that they were straight. Then Bernard invited us all over that night for dinner. His friend had a working stove in his room, Bernard explained to me, and they often prepared dinner together. His friend seemed shyly eager and enthusiastic. Back at our hotel on the Isle next morning, I conveyed the invitation to Bill and Ron. They were surprised, but accepted. I didn't mention how I'd met Bernard, but only explained that we had started talking and that I had ended up staying over at his apartment. We were expected at 7 o'clock. I suggested we bring a couple of bottles of wine, which we did. That's what I would have done in New York, and it seemed a reasonable thing to do in Paris. We spent about $4 each on 2 bottles of wine. Today, that would be the equivalent of about 40 or so apiece. I'm very glad we did. Dinner began with pâté, stuffed mushrooms, and olives, and went on to a spectacular lamb roast with lots of wonderful vegetable dishes and a glorious salad. The Africans recognized the wine as extremely good, and we got points for it. We were 6 for dinner. Bill, Ron, and myself, and Bernard and two of his African friends from the building. The one I hadn't met yet was a tall, soft-spoken, smiling, and I finally realized very smart and level-headed fellow, enough for me to recall it 45 years on. We all sat in Bernard's room, some on the bed, some in chairs around the wall, balancing a 5-foot by 5-foot square of plywood on our legs, while Bernard flung up a white tablecloth that momentarily filled the room, a spotless sail that billowed down to cover the board, so that, laughing, we all pulled and slid and pushed and adjusted it under the edge over our knees. Bernard went on to lay cloth napkins and gold-edged china on silver chargers. At that time, they were the first chargers any of us North Americans had seen, and cut crystal glassware for wine and water, and a wicker basket of French baguettes, and a silver ewer of peach and pink roses. Then Bernard and his stocky friend from the morning, I remember he wore a French-style sailor suit with a traditional boat neck, 3/4 sleeves, only with horizontal olive and mustard stripes, rather than red and white or blue and white, carried the food in from the apartment next door. Somehow not a glass of water was spilled, and when we were in the midst of things, somehow not a glass of wine was spilled, and when we were in the midst of things, I couldn't help thinking, with all that silver and bright china and flowers on the table, we could have been at the Four Seasons. It was an extremely fine, classic French meal, ending up with fruit and good cheeses, and I remember thinking, only gay men could have brought this off. These men truly enjoyed food and cooking. Today, the whole evening stays with me as a prime example of serious international camp, a combination of elegance and student poverty overcome. As dinner went on, the conversation in 3 languages, French, Senegalese, and English, Bernard's short friend, all 3 were gay, became quite taken with Bill, to which Bill was oblivious. Though Canadian, Bill spoke no French, and Ron and I had to translate for him. Therefore, most of the evening's sexual overtones escaped him. Bernard's friend contrived to sit next to Bill and, with a big smile, kept putting his arm around Bill's shoulder, who would, with a bemused smile, shrug it off. When we left and were walking in the street back to the Ypsilanti in our hotel, the first thing Ron said to me is, "They were gay, weren't they?" And I said, "Yes." Ron said, "Yeah, about halfway through, it dawned on me that something wasn't, well, quite what I thought." And Bill said, "Gay? What do you mean?" "My God, that was a good dinner. They were so nice. That was so nice of them, too, just having us over like that and not even knowing us." This was 4 years before Stonewall, and another world. The next day I went back, and Prince Bernard and I spent another pleasant afternoon in bed. But though he shows up by name as a tertiary character in a novel of mine called Nova, at the Von Rey's dinner party in Sao Rini, you'll note none of these incidents on which a year later I chose to model either my stories about matters gay from those years, I and Gomorrah, or Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stone, however coded, though I'm sure it would have yielded a more interesting, certainly a more characteristic, and probably a richer story than the more traditional ones, in literary thematic terms, than I actually wrote. But the fact is, none of the writing I published about that time, or during that time, gives a direct portrait of my sexual life back then. To repeat, this was 3 or 4 years before Stonewall. Back then you didn't write about things like that, except in code. You left clues that people could sometimes read between the lines, but it was actually dangerous to write about them. You could get in real trouble. You could get your friends in trouble. So you didn't do it, not in journals, not in letters, not in fiction. A few brave souls like Ned Rorem or Paul Goodman were exceptions, and some years later on, I tried to fill in a few incidents myself, but basically that wasn't me. Not all of my gay encounters led to dinner parties with Senegalese tribal princes, but many of them, now with a Dutch journalist a couple of days later in Paris, now with a young Greek student who wanted to learn English in Athens, now with a young Oxford student on a summer vacation in Greece, led to social interchanges that I profited from, or in some cases not only helped me out, but repeatedly helped out both my North American companions. The vast majority of my sexual encounters, often 2 or 3 in a day, were pleasant and friendly. So that when eventually back at the little white stone house above the Plaka in Athens, the 2 Greek sailors, my older British roommate brought home one night, raped me, described in a story called Citra and Trans, all that other was the context which gave that unpleasant incident the meaning for me it had. But the context was not a bland, unmarked progression of heterosexual encounters with their usual betrayals and breakups and cheatings. It was a context in which the vast majority of the thousands of sexual partners I already had picked for myself had ranged from friendly and helpful to at least sexually satisfactory to me at their worst. Yes, the unpleasant experience was a warning that I had to be more careful with whom I associated. Ever since I have been. By the same token, however, the goodwill and general pleasantness of the many, many others on both sides of it, before and after, are why the scars that remain from it are nowhere near as deep or debilitating as they might have been. This is confusion because of the very, very confused plane ride I just took. Forgive me. Who was your mentor when you were growing up? One interviewer asked me. Until I was an adolescent, I never knew I had any gay adult friends. When I was 17 in 1979, a friend of my soon-to-be wife, Marilyn Hacker, a young painter and sculptor, David Logan, introduced me to a married gay man named Bernard Kay, who lived on West End Avenue. He was multilingual, one of the few people I've known who could speak conversational Latin, French, and Spanish. And in a matter of weeks, he was my mentor. Soon he was Marilyn's. Marilyn's as well. She was my teenage confidant, and at 19, my wife. Though we only went to bed once, on the evening of my wedding, actually, Bernie and I were very close until his death from lung cancer in 1982, when I was 40. He was widely read. He read science fiction regularly, as well as literature. He had read Proust in French and written a novel unpublished about ancient Europe in Samaria. Though he was white and the son of a New England minister, he was best friends with Harlem Renaissance writer Bruce Nugent. They had become best friends at age 19 and 23 in New York and stayed friends until Bernie's death. Bernie knew many black actors and performers, including the young Gladys Knight, Earl Hyman, and the actor and composer Lorenzo Fuller. You might meet any one of these in his living room and later in his office down on the 19th floor of the Candler Building on 42nd Street. When you dropped in the early 50s, he had taken the part of Cassio in the famous Paul Robeson production of Othello with Jose Ferrar and Uta Hagen that had premiered at the Metropolitan Opera House, and he had directed Marlon Brando in his first Broadway appearance at age 19 in a children's play called Bobino. Certainly he was the most important adult male in my life, and Marilyn's, throughout our adolescence and adulthood. Whenever I was in New York, I saw him often several times a week, either at his house or at his office. Interviewer: was Bernie the first person to facilitate the process of creativity for you? Bernie K. was among the earliest and most important. He was also a child psychologist and a musician. One of his many adopted children had grown up to be a Catholic father, director of music in the Catholic Church in the Northeast, named Father Fred, as we knew him. Bernie was a committed atheist, but to show his affection for Fred, Bernie composed him a Mass in D minor. And for 3 months, I and my friends, Marilyn, who played the piano, and a fine musician and singer named Anna Perez, would arrive at Bernie's house at 5 in the morning, all of us sitting around the glass dining room table, copying parts and writing out the score for 3 hours every morning before we went off to school, now at the Bronx High School of Science, now at City College. For another overlapping 3 months, we met in the evening with a small group of singers to learn the choral parts. The Mass in D minor was eventually performed in a Brooklyn church with Lorenzo Fuller conducting and performing the baritone solo. One of the earliest of Bernie's fascinating projects with which I became involved. Bernie and his wife, Iva, and my daughter, Iva is named after Bernie's wife, lived at 845 West End Avenue and 101st Street, apartment 4B. When I first met Bernie, one of his adopted children was a neighborhood fellow named Eddie Serrano, who spoke in English at 19 was quite serviceable, but who had simply never mastered reading or in either English or Spanish. Bernie had arranged to give him 3 times a week English reading lessons, and these had been going on regularly for several months when I first got to know Bernie. One day I came in, and David Logan answered the door. Bernie and Eddie were sitting at the big glass dining room table, papers and books spread around them. "Go on," Bernie was saying. "Now read the whole sentence out loud." Following his finger across the page, Eddie read out, "For breakfast I had a big bowl of," but here he stalled. "Come on," Bernie said, "you're doing fine. See if you can sound it out, like we did with some of the other words." Eddie sat for another 5-10 seconds. Then he blurted, "A big bowl of oatmeal." And Bernie and David and I all laughed, and fortunately so did Eddie. The black actor Earl Hyman also became one of Bernie's protégés during his adolescence. Those of you who never saw Hyman perform live on Broadway or off-Broadway will likely still remember him as Bill Cosby's father, the elder Dr. Huxtable on The Cosby Show. Though I'd heard him tell this story several times before, often to groups of people at Bernie's apartment, the last time I heard this tale of his meeting with Bernie, back in the 40s, when Bernie and Iva lived in an apartment on Gramercy Park West, was when he was one of the eulogists at Bernie's memorial service, and he told this story to those of us who had come to honor Bernie's memory, while I sat next to Bruce Nugent. At the time of their meeting, Earl was 16, a year younger than I was when I first met Bernie. Earl had been in some community center theater project in Brooklyn, it was 1942, where a friend of Bernie's had noticed him and seen that he was particularly smart and talented, and sent young Earl to meet Bernie, much the way 17 years later I was sent to meet him in 1959. Earl described himself as a black kid born in North Carolina, now living in Brooklyn's Bedford-Stuyvesant, who had never yet been across the river to Manhattan, and who found himself sitting in the very elegant Gramercy Park living room with crocheted doilies on the mahogany end tables, the white shades and the brass lamps under the endless bookshelves where, at the time, Bernie and Iva were living. To put young Earl at his ease, who was speechless with awe, Bernie said, "Here, let me bring in some hot chocolate for us. We'll have a cup together, and you can tell me about yourself, all about yourself." So Bernie went out into the kitchen and, in a minute, came back with 2 cups of cocoa. He handed 1 cup and a saucer to Earl and went to sit across from him with his own cup. Earl looked down at the cup on his knee, overcome with adolescent embarrassment, and started to pick it up. The handle slipped from his fingers, the cup slid across the saucer, and fell to the hardwood floor, spilling cocoa all over. Mortified, Earl said he wanted to melt into the chair cushion. With his ears burning, he looked up, but in his seat, Bernie suddenly overturned his cup, spilling his own chocolate on the floor, and laughed. "Oh, don't worry, that's how we all do it here. Now, sit back and tell me what you're doing out in Brooklyn in that show I've heard so much about." Earl said that, in spite of himself, he began to laugh. They talked for another 3 hours, back and forth across puddles of chocolate. And from that time, he and Bernie became wonderful friends till Bernie's death 40 years later. But that's the sort of man Bernie was. I've said he was a close friend of the Harlem Renaissance writer Bruce Nugent. They had been best friends since Bernie was 19 and Bruce was 23. I first met Bruce in Bernie's living room a few months after I met Bernie himself. But Bernie is definitely another gay man whom I very much admired and wanted to be like. Another person who was wonderfully supportive of me was the poet Marie Pinceau. All told, though, Bernie was by far the most important of my mentors for both Marilyn and myself. Our daughter is named after Bernie's wonderful wife, who had been an actress in Bernie's theater company and who worked for many years in New York as an executive secretary for the Junior Leagues. In the dark living room, the wind gathers outside. Raindrops clatter on the panes, and branches lift and fall before the street light. When I look back across the table, I see another interviewer who has taken the place of the one I was just remembering. "Well," he asked, "what brings you joy in your private life currently?" Those experiences which, after some thought, alone in my room by myself, I can figure out how to express economically in language. Yes, it's a way of staying out of trouble. Interviewer: "What are you looking forward to accomplishing? In what ways will retirement from teaching be an accomplishment for you?" I think for a moment. Then I dare what is probably the most risky statement in this talk. I would love to retire from teaching and write another couple of novels. Thank you very much. In the words of Rachel Pollack, to you all, love, luxury, justice, and joy.